I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. This week I'm speaking to Toby Diggens, who runs Dig & Co, a design studio focusing on ecological landscape design and architecture. I met Toby through our mutual friend Butter Wakefield, and firstly, I'd like to say a big thank you to Butter for introducing me to Toby, because I could tell as soon as I spoke to him that he had fascinating and interesting ideas about what gardens and landscapes could be if we let the wilderness in. Toby's interest is in creating landscapes that echo the native landscape surrounding a site, and he experiments with a wider palette of plants that includes as much from the hedgerow as from the garden centre. I started by asking Toby to fill us in on exactly what makes his style of design special.
I love wild landscapes, whether it's wildernesses or gardens which have a sort of wild aspect added into them for a certain aesthetic. I really enjoy spending time travelling not only around the UK but also around Europe, studying these plant communities and wildernesses and how the landscape looks in, as far as I can see, some of the most beautiful places in Europe. And that's really the kind of inspiration I get from them. Okay. I think natural gardens in general are things which I find exciting, and there's a sort of dynamism within them which potentially goes a little bit beyond something that's a little bit more abstract and potentially textural for the sake of that one design idea. Mm-hmm. With that, I suppose, comes the fact that the gardens that I like to create and the landscapes that I like to create have a very strong link to the place that they originally were from. So a sort of historic look back at the landscape pre its development, for example, might offer up a certain set of design considerations which then add a lot of depth to the landscape and then potentially the plants and the structure that you put into it. Mm-hmm. And I suppose to say, if I have a name for what I do, I've been grappling with this ever since, this kind of idea of wild landscapes, wild gardening, and I suppose evoking wilderness came along, and about the best I've got to so far is aesthetic ecology, mm-hmm. where essentially you take the constructs and the laws of ecology and then you peg them to the fact that all people love a beautiful thing. And so a true wilderness potentially might jar with you because it would be lots of brambles, for example, and that's not necessarily aesthetic unless that's what you find aesthetic, but typically that's not. So it's about blending the ecological capacity of the site with its opportunities to be very beautiful.
So why is that style of gardening important to you?
It comes from a deep place within me. I was brought up in the countryside and brought up amongst sort of more wild places, and throughout my life I've always tended to travel to those wild places, and as a consequence, when I got into landscape architecture, it was a natural progression, I suppose, was to essentially evoke the landscapes that I loved being within. And it's just been over time that I've sort of learned about them and studied them. It's important also, I suppose, because of the fact that we're living in a time where the human pressure on natural environments is ever more known about and potentially ever increasing. Mm-hmm. And so the chance for a landscape architect or anybody, to be honest, to have an opportunity to show off what natural beauty can offer, not only from a very aesthetic standpoint, but also from a functional standpoint of the green spaces actually doing a lot for people health-wise, but also structurally. It's taking CO2 out of the air, it's cleaning the air, potentially it's cleaning the watercourses as well. So I suppose it's again that blend of the ecosystem working alongside the aesthetics, which is why it's important. So you feel like every time you make a move and you create a design, you're potentially having not only a positive impact on the beauty of the place, but also the actual sort of structural function of it.
That's quite interesting. I mean, you did actually answer one of my later questions, which was that you should consider the place in which you're siting the garden or the landscape that you're working on to see what grows there naturally and what would have been the natural state of things. So how do you know how far to take the design aspect of it? Is that where you as a designer comes in?
it all depends on the collaboration that you're undertaking with the client. And so you have to obviously match potentially the client's desires, dreams, hopes with potentially your knowledge of the natural capacity of the site.
Mm-hmm.
And it's treading that really interesting path to deliver, the end result, as it were, which can be a great journey, because I may come to a site and I'll look at it and I'll say, oh, look at this, these certain types of plants. And a client may say, well, I don't really want those. And yet what you could then potentially do is work within the brief to actually sort of re-include those at a later level in a more aesthetic environment. And as a consequence, they become less jarring.
Yeah.
I think it's about being completely open to the fact that everybody has ways and they have inspiration that comes from everywhere. And yet I suppose one thing that it's nice to be able to do when you come to a site is to start slowly but surely potentially educating people into the vibrancy and the dynamism which potentially already exists within the site, which can be phenomenal. And I'll just take a tiny example. I went to a great friend of mine's garden the other day who was really keen on getting some advice about what to do, and it's on a very steep slope. It turns out the people before had created this phenomenal, wildlife garden with just meadows sweeping over this hillside and beautiful hazel coppice. And I said, if it was me, the softest touch possible here will bring this garden back to life. And there's no doubt that it was a little bit ramshackle in places and a little bit of management wouldn't have gone amiss, but the main architecture of the site was actually already pretty amazing. So quite a good canvas to work off of to start with.
And do you think there'd ever be a time where you actually went somewhere and just went, do you know what, this is perfect as it is?
I suppose yes is the answer. I suppose I would hope for that in a funny sort of way, because that's the landscapes that I've been inspired by. So if I was to walk into a landscape and there was this phenomenal set of plant communities and magical architecture and light that was playing off the trees in a special way, I would get goosebumps and I would say, I don't think I can do any work here. But in reality, I think that you're very rarely walking into a designed wilderness, as it were. And so there might always be suggestions that you could make. And typically, if you are being called upon for your advice and your services, for example, it's normally tied to the construction of a new house or a new owner. And so even if all it is a management report where you're just suggesting methods of maintaining the landscape that is there today, you've still potentially got a part to play. Because as we both know, doing what we do, a landscape is the only kind of artistic creation which never sits still.
Yeah, that's very true. So when you say that you work with people who are building houses or typically redoing things, because you like the natural aesthetic, do you think that that would mean that you eschew hard landscaping, or is that something that you embrace?
It's always been a really interesting question in my mind. How close can you drag the landscape back up to the house? And I think that with new technologies and new designs and new ways of people thinking about the holistic approach to designing a site, there is the potential to maybe do away with a little bit of hard landscaping in places. Nonetheless, I 100% recognise the fact that, and agree with the fact that designed places for people which create routes through a garden to potentially a pergola or a deck leaning out over a pond is no bad thing, because actually it allows you to embrace the landscape more. And in a domestic scenario, it's one of those things that lends itself to a design where if you were to walk 1,000 times to your pond without hard landscaping, it would be a muddy path. And so you think to yourself, well, it does just make perfect sense to actually pave the path beautifully.
Yeah.
And so when you finish the work and your client's happy and he or she's got their mates coming around, they've got something to be proud of. And at the end of it could be the beautiful biological aspect, I suppose, of the landscape architecture that shows itself off better because of what you've done to enhance the landscape from a hard perspective. So I don't think it's a bad thing to do hard landscaping, although I would say that in housing developments, where hard landscaping is used willy-nilly as a way of designing efficiency and convenience in. There should probably be a bit of a check on that. And that's where the idea of obviously sustainable drainage systems and permeable paving potentially comes into its own. So quite a good debate.
Well, I think it's very much a misnomer that hard landscaping is low or no maintenance, because it's not, and it's got a finite life, whereas something that's green and natural can evolve, as you say. So it's not always just an easy solution to just bung in.
Yeah, it's expensive.
Yeah, and it is very expensive, in lots of ways. Obviously, I think probably your clients come to you because, they respect the way that you design, and that's probably what you're known for and what you will become more known for. But do you think on the whole, it is a little bit of an uphill battle to get people to appreciate wilderness a little bit more? Do you think we're not quite there yet with our appreciation of it as an aesthetic?
That's a really good question. I think that the appreciation of wilderness is definitely something which there probably needs to be more of it, but it would be a very good idea for people to spend potentially more time within wilderness, or at least perceived wilder areas, because then they would potentially start to understand the kind of structure and the overall beauty. I think a lot of potential wildernesses are brought to people through media, and it's hard to actually appreciate all of the different aspects and be kind of clothed in the experience, as it were. I think that we're sort of touching on a really interesting time in landscape architecture and in design in general, which is that we're becoming aware of our impact when we develop things. I'm not sure of the exact number, but quite a large percentage of carbon dioxide emissions are created by the development industry, so, construction. And that must include landscape in cities, for example. I think there is a great opportunity, and it's exciting to be able to be a part of a team of people who sort of sit at the intersection between traditional architecture and building things in a hard manner, and very much what the biological aspects of the world can do to potentially help and enhance the built form of cities and gardens. So I do think that it does probably take a little bit of potentially educating and, just gentle sort of pushing towards maybe a slightly more evocative, slightly more exciting vision than maybe the one that a client has thought up themselves. And I suppose that's where you could say the value of a landscape architect or a landscape designer comes in, is that not necessarily just about bringing your ideas, but it's about actually bringing the ideas of the client out more. And with that will obviously come your ideas and the way that your ideas are grounded. And so you will probably together push that design, or certainly in my case, will push that design to more of sort of wild, natural aesthetic, which hopefully, after every job, shows itself beautifully and becomes something that people, would look for and hope for in the future.
I think that, without wishing to sound too airy-fairy, I think that those wilder landscapes do touch people, but maybe on a more subconscious level. And I think perhaps it's a language that we've slightly forgotten. So I don't think we've forgotten it that much. It's just maybe buried a bit deep. So people do perhaps need a bit of prodding to kind of appreciate it. In my garden this year, I've been quite outrageous, and I've left lots of weeds, so-called weeds and wildflowers, to just do their thing. So on a kind of domestic scale, I'm always aware that people are talking about plants for pollinators, but should we be thinking about plants that provide food for, say, the larval stages of insects? Do we need to be thinking about sources that are beyond just nectar and pollen?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the pollinator thing is a fantastic headline for the plight of insects, and I'm sure that we've all read the headlines about there being large declines in insects over the last sort of 35, 40 years, which is tragic, obviously, and something that, again, we can hope to be a part of reversing. But I think that there's absolutely no doubt that focusing on pollinators could potentially push you in the direction where you may actually be not having any long-lasting benefits for the site overall. So when you design your garden, for example, you should be thinking about the structure of it, not just in the flowers, but also in all the different types of leaves, all the different types of plants. And there's an amazing study done that I read when I was just finishing up my master's, which was done by James Hitchmore and a few others, where essentially they found out that native plants, and that this is not just flowering native plants, but native plants in general, were typically of a higher value to insects when studied, and even plants that came from Europe, and especially plants that came from the southern hemisphere. And whilst all of those other plants were useful, they were nowhere near as useful as the natives. And at the same time as that, one thing that stood out starkly was a study that was conducted, which was a sort of side piece, which was that native trees are absolutely vital, and that non-native trees tend to have a very low ecological capacity. So I would 100% recommend leaving native plants if they look lovely, but also using native trees. And there are not a great number versus the number of trees in the world, but there are a good number of trees which you can use structurally and aesthetically in your garden, which are native, which will be obviously having that sort of positive impact. So yeah, I think it's important that we focus on creating more of a habitat for nature than specifically focusing on the fact that, let's say, an aster does well for a honeybee, both of which aren't native. So we have no idea that that's doing any good for any other insect.
Yeah, that's very true. There's also the problem that a lot of plants get demonised in sometimes ridiculous ways. I mean, I leave ragwort in my garden, which I know is the food source for the cinnabar moth, and I live in quite a rural area, so I'm very careful that it sort of stays within, I try and keep it in the middle of my garden. But are there any other plants that you think that have had really bad press that are actually very, very good for wildlife? Because I think the cinnabar moth, although I have seen it on other plants, I have also read that it is the sole food source, which I don't actually believe, because as I say, I've seen it and I've heard of it munching other things. But for some of these things that we are so keen to get rid of, they will be perhaps the sole food source for certain species. So are there any that are really unfairly demonised that you can think of?
One personal love of mine on the sort of wild plant front at the moment is all of the thistles. And there are lots of different types of thistles in the UK, many of which in their own right, in the right habitat, look absolutely stunning. There's a marsh thistle, which is Circeum palustre, which in where we live in Devon is, it carpets this area of rushy, slightly wet meadow. In the evenings, if you were to walk up through these thistles when they're flowering, it's absolutely carpeted in moth. That's just one example. One other thing that I do know is crucial is that if you were, for example, to sow a meadow in your garden, which obviously I think is a lovely thing to do, not only aesthetically but biologically, quite a lot of our meadow butterflies specifically lay their eggs on types of grass. And obviously that grass requires being longer than 2 millimetres or 5 millimetres or whatever. And so, yes, there are a lot of interrelationships or symbioses with various plants and various butterflies. You can do a lot to obviously add to the overall dynamism of your garden by potentially leaving areas a little bit more wild, because you don't necessarily have to study every single butterfly and where, which grass it lays its eggs on, but there's a high likelihood that one of the grasses in that wilder area, one of the butterflies will. And so you'll wake up one summer morning and there'll be butterflies all over your garden where once there weren't. And it's not to do with the fact that you've got lots of flowers. It's actually just to do with the fact that you've got a little bit of long grass.
Yeah, oh wow, that's interesting.
So it is fascinating, that one. And obviously the more into it you are, the more you read about it, the more you realise how many things, not necessarily just go and pollinate one plant, but actually lay their eggs specifically on one plant. And that's obviously quite key to keep the generations going. One thing I wrote down actually was that on the same subject as your ragwort, I had a lovely experience this summer when I was walking through, it's so parched everywhere. And there's this meadow that the Avon Wildlife Trust did in Bristol. And it just looked stunning because there wasn't hundreds and hundreds of plants of ragwort, but there were about 30 or 40 that just stood erect and above the grass height. It reminded me of the prairies and goldenrod, and I thought, amazing, here's our own version of goldenrod, looking absolutely stunning with butterflies all over it. yeah, I'm a bit of a fan of ragwort myself at the moment.
Yeah, it's a good plant. It really is. I don't know how it survives anyway, because when I went out to look at mine, it was absolutely shredded to pieces. There was not one bit of it left. So whether it will have had the chance to seed around or come back next year, I don't know. But it was stripped. So I should think the moths do a good job of keeping it, in check anyway.
Well, yeah, I suppose the natural order of things would dictate that slowly but surely it evens out. But ragwort requires open ground to germinate. So the reason you see such massive proliferations of it sometimes in the countryside is nothing to do with the ragwort's fault. It's because somebody has potentially not looked after their field enough and has not moved on livestock before they've poached the ground, and so it opens up the ground to ragwort, which loves to colonise their patches.
Right. So is there anything that I probably shouldn't allow in my garden? It's not a huge space. Is there anything that's particularly badly behaved that I really should hoik out?
Well, I wrote down a couple of things for this actually, because obviously everybody's got their pet hate.
Yep.
I was chatting to a guy who digs drains the other day, and he hates willows because they get in his drains. So if you don't like things getting in your drains, then get rid of willows. But brambles, obviously in a small space, will take over so rapidly that there's really little you can do than to try and either keep them ultra contained somewhere or just get rid of them, because they keep coming back. They're great for wildlife too, but I think in a small space, there's not enough of it.
Yeah.
Blackthorn, similarly, if you have a blackthorn sucker that gets in under a fence or something, it'll just keep running, and eventually you'll have a thicket. And realistically, blackthorn loves to be hacked down. It was once, eaten by all sorts of grazing animals, so it naturally wants to regrow. So I'd say blackthorn can be something you should try and keep a check of. And at the same time as that, nettles. Everyone says, "Oh, have a little patch of nettles in your garden." Well, if you have a small space, then a patch of nettles could be quite a valuable space, and they will just continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
So don't get me wrong, if you have space for nettles and they're amazing for lots of butterflies, then by all means have some, and they're great for tea as well. But if you've got a small space, then I think nettles just, you can do without them. There's a lot of other plants that do well.
Yeah, that's true. Dock is my personal bugbear, so I do get that out. But then that's a shame, because I think I've probably taken some out that are the different type. I think they're the meadow dock, and they're actually beautiful. So you do need to be a little bit careful, I suppose, when you're waging war on these things. Are there any ornamentals that would compete? Because again, I've left my kind of wildflowers in a separate area to my ornamental bed, but actually I am going to try and mix the two together. So what would compete with the wilder species?
I always take the view that once upon a time, the ornamentals that we all have in our gardens were once wild. So once again, it comes back to the study of plant diversity and ecology to work out what might work in the right place, and that's where I always start with design. I've done some trials on this at home in some test beds that we sowed with a standard UK meadow mix, and then put in lots of different ornamental perennials from pretty much all over the world. And I found that things like Persicaria bistorta, so that one's good. There's lots of different thalictrums seem to work as long as they're from Europe. The sort of well-known Cirsium rivulare, the sterile clone, the Atropurpureum, can hold its own. It's holding its own really well in quite a sort of damp meadow that I've sowed. The slightly taller Achillea filipendulina, that one, which actually I think comes from the steppe in Russia, but from wet places on the steppes, done perfectly well, has actually increased in size. A lot of the asters do pretty well. European digitalis, so foxglove species. Our standard foxglove obviously needs a bit of bare ground. But the rusty foxglove and the woolly foxglove have been absolutely fine. And again, you need to disturb the ground every now and again to reinvigorate the seed and let the seeds set on bare ground. But again, that's about a management thing. And interestingly, the last one, there's a grass actually I think comes from North Africa called Penicetum macrorum, which is absolutely stunning. It's a sort of big version of the standard little Penicetums that you see, but it's got a much more compact, more sort of elongated head. Stunning. And actually everybody always says it does terrible things in the standard ornamental bed because it just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Right.
So I thought, well, I'll chuck it in the grass and see what happens. And it's created this beautiful sort of architecture within the grass, but it's just slowly creeping out. It's perfect for that job. So I suppose in all, it's about finding and looking at plants. And I think more and more are going to emerge through all the studies that I'm doing where this happens. And look for the plant that naturally lives in those kind of scenarios anyway. And you'd be surprised at how well they sometimes do.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the key to having a landscape or a garden that is lower maintenance. If you can get the plant communities right in the first place, then you're not constantly fighting against nature, and things should reach a much easier equilibrium. So I think we will get better at that. I think we'll do less of this artificial propping up of our borders and more of our actually planning things sensibly and observing, because as you say, you're doing the work now, and I think people like James Hitchmer and Nigel Dunnett have been doing the work for a while, and maybe not people like Noel Kingsbury, but actually there aren't that many people who are going, do you know what, we've got to get sensible with this, we've got to actually look at what works next, and what can work cheek by jowl. It is going to be trial and error for people, especially in their own sites which have got their own specific conditions. So there is an element of the unknown about it, but it's definitely an interesting journey. So if people wanted to grow plants that were slightly more in their kind of wild form, you can't always buy those in nurseries. So what would you suggest people do if they want to get hold of things like that?
It depends on the sort of garden centre or nursery that you go to, but there are a couple where I have actually started to notice 9cm pots of some of our native meadow species. So that's encouraging for sure. It is hard to find very specific native-only or near-native plant selections, and at the same time as that, have a knowledge that you're only essentially looking for those plants, because there are lots of nurseries out there who will be suggesting lots of different plants, and they'll come from all over the world. So if you're keen on reining back your scope and looking at, I think Europe's a better version of our sort of nativeness than just England. We're only a tiny extension of Europe, and as a consequence, all of our plants post the Ice Age came from there anyway. So most of the European plants that you can find will probably do pretty well in our scenarios. It's just they didn't happen to get here when the Ice Age retreated. But there are a couple of great websites, actually. I don't know if you know of Emma's Gate or I think it's wildseed.co.uk. I spend a lot of time looking through their selections, and they grow on a lot of plants and then take the seed. You can actually purchase the seed and then either sow it into a meadow or sow it into a border if you wanted to, or, as me and my mum quite often do, bring on the plants so they're slightly larger, and as a consequence you can put them into more drastic scenarios and see how they do. Yeah. So they've got a little bit more bulk. The last option is that I don't think it's illegal to take seed off the heads of the plant. Right. So in the autumn, very regularly we'll go out seed collecting, so that you actually may well find a very vigorous strain of a certain native plant that then obviously you can potentially put into a new scenario and see if it works. So that's quite interesting, and I would highly recommend doing that if you've got some species-rich meadows nearby. Bear in mind, you're not allowed to dig up any wild plants, so absolutely don't do that. Especially if it's something like an orchid, because orchids rely on fungus to actually live from. So if you dig up an orchid, you're condemning it anyway. It's not going to live in a pot. Right. So don't do that. Yeah, so don't do that. But as we move forward in this kind of more holistically looking way of designing, it's likely that there's going to become more and more people from the supply side actually suggesting these plants in a more sort of pointed manner, rather than just being part of a big stock of plants from everywhere. And the other thing that I think might be useful to mention is there probably aren't a huge amount of them, but can you recommend any good books or websites for people who are thinking about doing this in their own gardens? Yeah, definitely. Start with The Wild Garden by William Robinson. And I've actually got the version which is forwarded by a guy called, I think it's Rick Dark. Yeah. And that's a fantastic book to basically go into the mind's eye of the man who first thought about gardening with nature. So it's a tone, it's where you should begin. It's absolutely phenomenal how so many of the plants that we all use today were the ones that he was using and trialing. The dynamic landscape is a little bit more of an educational book, something potentially more for the professional, but if you're really keen, I would highly recommend it. It's almost a group of scientific papers written by the likes of Nigel Dunnett and James Hitchmore and certain practitioners from Europe, and some of the wisdom in there is phenomenal, especially from a public landscapes perspective and minimal cost to minimal maintenance because of limited budget. Meadows of Great Dixter and Beyond by Christopher Lloyd is another gem, and he's very much, I suppose, was almost sort of protagonist of this very similar kind of style of trialing plants actually in wild or more habitat-based settings. And then lastly, a book that was brought out by James Hitchmore last year or the year before, I can't remember, called Sowing Beauty, which again is, if you're into this kind of style, it's just, it's an encyclopedia of knowledge. The man is a genius and has done so much research into creating a beautiful, aesthetic, but wild and functioning ecosystem that you can, every page you can be glued to if you're into it.
Yeah, that's a brilliant book, and it's got a lot of kind of applicable knowledge in it as well. So just, I suppose, the last word really is if you had any advice for people who are thinking of doing this in their gardens, because it is quite brave actually, and it is quite unusual. What advice would you give people?
I just jotted down, be patient. The world didn't evolve overnight, and the plants and habitats that you might decide to create in your garden are going to have to, especially if you're starting from scratch, kind of get used to living next to one another, for want of a better way of describing it. And over time, things are going to change, and you will get disappointment when potentially a plant that you absolutely love on its own doesn't work in the scenario that you've put it in. But don't be downhearted and just keep working with the site. Keep being patient and watching things as the seasons change. And you may find that there's a particular time when planting a certain set of plants actually works better because they can, for example, get their roots down before the frost, or actually you may find that just before the grass starts to grow, you can insert plants and they get their heads above the grass and off they go. So it's about being very responsive to the site, and every site, as we know, is so different. And also the other thing I would say is that a lot of people think that the natural method of gardening is very hands-off. I would actually say that it's the opposite. It's just a very different method. Where with normal gardening, you're becoming knowledgeable about a particular shrub, exactly what type of fertilizer it likes, and its habit and form. You're looking at the site as a whole. You're looking at potentially the woodland section that you've created or the meadow section that you've created. And you're trying to manage them like those archetypal landscapes that you're trying to mimic in the wild. So just as an example, meadows are a sort of semi-wild but also semi-human landscape that were managed for hay. They are absolutely beautiful, but they require work. And so don't think that because you've jumped off the traditional gardening bandwagon onto the wild bandwagon that you need to down tools and sit there, because actually it'll turn into a mess. But it is about being very responsive to the site and allowing it to do things that maybe you would have been a bit tentative to do in the past.
Yeah.
But it's fun, it's really beautiful to watch wildlife become encouraged to be amongst you. And I think that's probably the most proud thing you can feel when it works, is that not just do you have beautiful plants flowering away, but you've got insects and bees and birds and mammals and everybody's in there all together because you've actually created a little miniature ecosystem, and that's really special.
So there you have it. We need to create our own unique landscapes that work with instead of against nature, and sometimes we should let the weeds in. Thanks, Toby, for your time and for your refreshing point of view. I have a feeling we'll be hearing a lot more from Toby in the future. And if you'd like to find out more about his design company and the research he's produced and where you can find him online, do check out the show notes on the website where you'll find all his details. I asked Toby to give a name to what he was doing in the interview, and he said the best label he could come up with for now is Aesthetic Ecology, which does seem to be a pretty good description of this style of gardening and designing. I visited Pam Lewis's garden, Sticky Wicket, a few years back, and I was deeply influenced by the style in which she gardens. Weeds, wildflowers, ornamentals, all coexisting together in a designed fashion that was a haven for wildlife, and it was about as magical a garden as I've ever visited. And I feel like Toby is working very much in a similar vein to Pam, but people gardening in this style are few and far between, which is why I was so delighted to meet him and to interview him. I've put a couple of pictures up on the blog from my visit to Sticky Wicket, so do have a look at that if you're interested, because Pam no longer opens her garden to the public, and you can just about still get hold of a copy of her book Sticky Wicket, which is out of print, but you can get secondhand copies. I did call the book's publisher and they have no plans to reissue it, but who knows, maybe in the future as this style of gardening grows, they may recognise this as one of the few books that deals well with the subject of wild gardening. So a very big thank you again to Toby for speaking to me, and I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, and I will catch you all next Tuesday.